Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Inevitably, we all are very much interested in what's happening in our big neighbors, China and Japan. In fact, yesterday, I'm sure you heard news about President Park Geun-hye's proposal to write a common history textbook for 3 countries, obviously Korea, China, and Japan, as Germany and France and Poland did after World War II. Well, other than that, a lot has been happening in our neighbors on both political and economic fronts, and all of them obviously will have critical implications for us. This morning we have very fortunate to have David Pilling. I'm sure most of you, unless you know him well, you know of him well by reading his award-winning columns in Financial Times. In fact, he wrote a column yesterday regarding Abenomics and about Japan. He will share with us his illuminating and insightful views on China and Japan. I'm sure he is the leading journalist who has the expertise on these 2 big countries. He is currently, as he is the Asia editor of Financial Times. As you know, he has been writing regularly in Financial Times, and also he is as an Asian editor since 2008. He oversees the Financial Times coverage of the Asia region from Afghanistan to Australia, of course, including China, India, and Japan. As I mentioned, he writes regularly on Financial Times. He is very well known, the moderator in various global forums, including the World Economic Forum in Davos. And in fact, you got he will have a new book out in January. In fact, the copy was distributed about his book. Is the Bending Adversity, the Art of Survival, of Japanese survival. And he lived there for 6 years, so he knows Japan better than I'm sure any. And so he will tell what's happening there in Japan. And also a lot has been happening in China in recent months in particular. So he will share his enlightening views with us. In fact, he interviewed President Lee Myung-bak when he was in office. And actually he interviews heads of nations and important political leaders in this region in particular. So I had the privilege of meeting him when he interviewed President Lee last time. Well, with no further ado, I would like to invite David Pilling. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Il Sakon, for that very generous introduction. You've raised the stakes quite high. I have to be insightful and illuminating at this early hour in the morning. I can only say that I will do my very best. There's a very impressive title behind me. I've actually kind of taken the liberty of slightly rewriting the title, although the subject is the same. But I just thought this morning that I would call my talk, if it is a talk, it's a bunch of notes actually, but I thought I would call it After the Pax Americana. I've been asked to talk about Northeast Asia. Mr. Il-Sakong mentioned Japan and China, but I think there are two other nations that I must talk about at least a bit. One is Korea itself, although I'm hesitant to do that in front of such an expert audience, and it's probably the country of the four that I know the least. And the fourth, of course, is the US, that well-known Northeast Asian power. But of course, no discussion of this region without the US is really worth having. So the changing face of diplomatic and economic relations in this region. I think the starting point is that the post-war order is changing significantly. The Pax Americana, as it has existed for 70 years, more or less, is unsustainable in its present form. We all know the reasons for that. The principal one is the rise of China. Of course, the US has its own local difficulties. So I'm going to look at the four countries, and I'll end by making a few tentative conclusions. As with all sort of talks which end with a question mark, I will, of course, not answer the question. I'll tell you in advance. But at least I hope that by kind of analysing the present, I might be able to offer some insights into the future. But unfortunately, crystal ball is not something I possess. Before I look at the four countries in turn, I really want to look at two very recent events, which I think depict a very different, almost contradictory picture in this region. The first event is the US shutdown. Now, the US kind of opened itself, one could say, to a degree of ridicule in the world. Here is the world's most powerful country, and you know it can't operate a panda camera in one of its zoos. It has to send home its civil servants. You know, this was a kind of a very open manifestation of what we've come to see as, rightly or wrongly, and we'll go on to that, of American weakness. So not only was there a shutdown, there was a credible suggestion. I mean, I think it was never going to happen, but there was a credible suggestion that the US might actually default on its debt. There is, of course, an extraordinary division at the heart of US government. And at the heart of that division, I would say, are two things. In the long run, I think there is tremendous angst in the US about the decline, or at the very least the stagnation of the middle class. Remember, median wages in the US have not really moved in 40 years. All the economic gains that have happened in the US have really gone to the top 1%. While the top 1% don't mind so much, and while they run things more or less, still that's creating a lot of division within the US. The second, I think, is more recent, and it's the 2008 economic crisis and how to deal with that. And that has kind of riven the US. You know, there have been arguments over whether Keynesian policies are necessary, counter-cyclical spending, on the whole tax regime, and indeed the role of government itself. And of course, the big symbol of this argument has been the rise of the Tea Party, and in a sense, it's kind of hijacking of the Republican Party. Now, what was the result of the US shutdown as far as this region was concerned? Well, the result was that Mr. Obama could not afford a ticket to come to Asia to attend the Bali summit. Of course, he could have afforded a ticket, but symbolically, it was considered not the right thing to do. So the US shutdown is a kind of a symbol of, and one should be very careful about exaggerating this, but it's a symbol of possible fading US influence in this region to come. At a time, of course, when the US is talking about a pivot, it's talking about coming back to the region. And again, we need to be careful because, in a sense, it has never left. And just before I leave the shutdown scenario, Syria, I think, obviously not quite in this region, but Syria was an even bigger example of that US uncertainty about its role in the world. A red line was drawn, and then Mr. Obama embarrassingly had to retreat from that red line and be saved, in a sense, by Russia, not normally considered the US's great friend. So event number 2, which is, I would say, entirely contradictory to the event that I've just talked about, that is Typhoon Hainan, the tragedy now unfolding in the Philippines. What did we see in the Philippines? Did we see China filling the gap left by America? Chinese soft power? No, we did not. China, when I last looked, had donated $100,000 to the Philippine effort. Korea donated 50 times that amount. The US, of course, the USS Washington is just about to arrive with all the force and force for good in this case that implies. That's US goodwill in that sense is alive and well. And even Japan, which of course invaded the Philippines in the 1940s, has now sent 1,000 SDF, Self-Defense Force members, and $10 million. So this is a picture that's rather contradictory to the one that I presented before. So what is the true picture? Ian Bremmer, the head of the Eurasia Group, says that we're living in what he calls a G0 world. We had a G7, then we had a kind of a unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet system. We moved briefly to a G20 after the financial crisis, which is now really, I think, fading as a sort of a body that can agree on very much. And so Bremer says that we're in a G0 world. Nobody's really in complete control. Certainly the United States does not have the appetite that it once did to be the policeman of the world. Of course that can change, but that's what we have. So we're moving from something that we kind of understood, we may not have liked, but we understood a world in a sense policed by the United States, to something else. And we don't know quite what that something else is. So let me start with China. I think one big and very important fact about China is that the further you go away from China, the stronger it looks. So in the United States, if you ask people about the Chinese economy, a majority of Americans will say that the Chinese economy is bigger than that of the United States. This is not true, but the perception is that China has already overtaken the United States. The closer you get to China, the more fragile and difficult things look. That is not at all to underestimate the incredible last 30 years, but that is true. And you don't have to take my word for it. Wen Jiabao talked incessantly about the unbalanced, uncoordinated China and the difficulties of its economy. So what has happened to the Chinese economy in the last 10 years? Remember Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, their big, what they set out for their 10 years in office was harmony, to kind of rebalance the economy. Now, some people have said that they failed totally in that. I think that's going too far. There was some rebalancing. There has been a shift of growth from the eastern coastal regions to the west, and the regions that are growing fastest now are regions like Yunnan and Guizhou, regions that were not that had previously been kind of left out. There has also, I think, been some improvement in terms of the life of farmers, those, in a sense, left behind. Infrastructure has improved in the countryside. So in a sense, there has been, living standards have risen to a certain extent. There has been a bit of rebalancing, but on the whole, I think you could say that, if anything, the rebalancing that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao sought has sort of gone the other way. One of the main reasons for that, of course, is the 2008 financial crisis and China's response to the 2008 financial crisis, which was to double up on their bet. And the bet is that China is still an economy that is investment-led. It's true it was investment and export-led, and exports are now less important, and that another act of rebalancing, if you will, has been allowing the renminbi to slowly appreciate. But nonetheless, investment is still, according to official accounts, around just under 50% of GDP. And that has really never been seen. The great sort of Northeast Asian success stories, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, they had investment-led models as well, but investment never really reached much above 35% of GDP. 50% is really, we haven't seen that before, and it sort of can't be healthy. Much of that investment must be inefficient. It must be building up non-performing loans in the financial sector. We're reaching a stage where China is having to put more and more input, whether it be capital or energy, to get out less and less. And the economy has been slowing. I mean, I think it should be slowing, but we've seen the economy slow from an overheated 13% just a few years ago to now suddenly the Chinese government is talking about 7%. That's really quite a dramatic slowing. And yet still, they're pouring, they're feeding this investment fire with more and more and more coal. Clearly something needs altering here. Now, when Xi Jinping came to power about a year ago, there was all sorts of talk that he might be a reformer, a political reformer and an economic reformer. Now, I think he has paid fairly quickly to the idea that he's a political reformer. There is going to be no glasnost, perestroika in China. Xi Jinping's first year has really been about consolidating his power. He's in charge of the three big offices. He's made a big deal about showing that he's in charge of the armed forces. He's launched an anti-corruption drive, which has scared the hell out of a lot of the cadres and has gone much further than people imagined. Now, some people thought that what he was doing was signaling left in Chinese political terms, towards a kind of, nostalgia for the Maoist past, let's say, to oversimplify, in order to turn right, in order to provide cover for economic reforms. Now, if that's true, if Xi Jinping is a closet economic reformer, then he is still, I would argue, very, very deeply in the closet, kind of hiding behind the fur coats. There is no indication yet that that China is serious about opening its system to the markets. The communique from the third plenum that we had earlier this week did talk about a decisive shift to the markets, but there was no detail, and there was also a lot of counter language about the preeminent role of the state-owned enterprises. We had expected, or some people had expected, actually I hadn't really, but many people had expected, detailed plans on farmers' rights to sell their own land, on the hukou system, which, as you know, is a way of controlling where people live, and to begin to dismantle the hukou system was seen as a way of providing a new impetus to growth by allowing a new kind of wave of urbanization. But that is not happening, or not obviously happening in any big way. Reforms to the financial system, a liberalization of interest rates so that banks could start lending to the small companies that are likely to provide the kind of innovative future that China will now need, as its ability merely to add labor begins to run out of steam. But again, there's no real indication of that coming out of the third plenum. And as I said, the SOEs, which have been the vehicle by which this investment-led growth has been managed, pouring credit into the SOEs. There's really no strong indication that those SOEs are going to be brought to heel, much less privatized, or even open to more private competition. So that's the sort of domestic Chinese picture. So what about the international picture? Well, China has moved from smile diplomacy to something that looks a bit more like frown diplomacy. For the last 20, 30 years, China has managed its rise in the region extremely well in many ways. It has not, in fact, even talked about its rise. Deng Xiaoping talked about hiding China's light under a bushel, keeping quiet. And China had done that really rather successfully until a few years ago, when that smile, as I said, turned to something of a frown. Now, who is to blame will, of course, depends if you are in Beijing or Manila, or Vietnam or Tokyo or wherever. People will blame each other. But the truth is that China is now in argument with many countries around the region, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Japan, in the East China Sea, over the Senkaku Diaoyu, especially. And of course, that was one of the reasons why China was not able to help the Philippines, because its help was presumably not that welcome. It lacks soft power. It lacks friendly relations with the Philippines. Now, if you look around from China's point of view, you look around its borders to see all its friends, and you look kind of not exactly in vain, but China doesn't have many friends. The world doesn't look like a particularly friendly place from Beijing. Its friends are North Korea. Its friends are Pakistan, Laos and Cambodia, which have more or less, I would argue, been bought. And there's not a sort of great collection of allies. China's non-interventionist policy is also, I would argue, beginning to kind of come under strain, or at least, there are question marks over how long that's sustainable, as China's influence in the world, because of its economic needs and its needs for resources, for oil and coal and iron ore, continue to grow despite the slowdown of the Chinese economy. We saw that in Libya, where suddenly, when the Libyan regime was collapsing, suddenly we found out there were 30,000 Chinese working in Libya. Who knew that? Sudan, when Sudan split, oil was in one part and the kind of, pipelines and refineries, etc., in another. This presents China with a complex diplomatic conundrum. Merely non-intervention is a trickier policy. And of course, North Korea, much closer to home. China has been seen as a defender, as a bankroller of North Korea. They're closer than lips and teeth And yet, of course, North Korea's behavior is increasingly annoyed China, and China is having to try to put some pressure on Pyongyang through financial sanctions, through supporting sanctions in the UN, more than it had before. So there's this kind of tension. Just finally on China, it seems likely that barring some great crisis, and I don't personally really expect a great crisis of the sort that some people talk about. And even if there were a great crisis, remember America had a civil war on its way to becoming the world's biggest economy. You know, big economies with momentum can kind of take a few knocks along the way. So barring, you know, something completely unforeseen, by around 2020, China will be the world's biggest economy, but it will not have the world's highest GDP per capita, nothing like it. China today has a GDP per capita roughly the same as, you know, countries like Albania, Algeria, El Salvador. Per capita, we have a relatively poor country with some very rich pockets. But in aggregate, just because of the size of China, we're going to have a huge country with historical grievances, with a China dream, and we really don't know, at least I really don't know, what that might mean. So let's turn now to Japan. Now, the big development in Japan recently has obviously been the election of Shinzo Abe last December for the second time. But Shinzo Abe Mark II is certainly very different from Shinzo Abe Mark I. So what brought about Abe's, in a sense, very unlikely return when he left power in 2007? It really did not, I was at the press conference, it really did not look as though he was coming back. But here he is. So why? Well, I think one of the reasons is definitely the dispute with China over Diaoyu Senkaku. That meant that a nationalist like Abe suddenly became electable. Before, Abe was more or less kind of picked by Koizumi. People had no real say. The LDP had a say, but not really people. But Abe's nationalism was a sort of was a liability, more or less, in Japan. That liability has now become, I think, largely because of the dispute with China, to some extent because of friction with South Korea as well. That nationalism has shifted onto the kind of asset side. Then Japan has had 20 years of relative economic stagnation, while, and I see you've kindly handed out the pamphlet to my book, while I don't think that its economy has been quite as dreadful as this image in the last 20 years, certainly things have not been going brilliantly, I think we can fairly say. And of course, because nominal GDP has been stuck, the debt has risen to dangerous proportions. On top of that, you had the 2008 financial crisis, which killed Japan's export markets, and you've had an enormous jolt by the 2011 tsunami, whose biggest kind of economic impact, I think, was to close down Japan's nuclear generation capacity, which has left Japan now with trade deficits rather than the trade surpluses it was used to, which has left companies, big manufacturers, worried about where they're going to get their cheap and stable energy supplies from. This was a huge jolt. And I think Abe, who comes from, or his political ground is Yamaguchi province, which was the old Choshu, which played a vital role in the Meiji Restoration, whose motto, in a sense, was, you know, we need to internationalize in order to be able to defend ourselves. We need a strong economy, a modern economy, so that we're not colonized. And I think that this is kind of in Japanese, it's called Fukoku Kyohei. It actually comes from a Chinese phrase from the Warring States period. But this was the kind of the motto. Strong economy, strong army, or rich economy, strong army. And I think that that is Abe's motivating factor. He thinks unless Japan's economy can be made strong again, unless growth can be restored, unless the debt problem can be solved, Japan will be weak. It won't be able to defend itself. It's a hostile region. China didn't fall apart as the Japanese hoped for years. Here it is, overtook Japan in 2010, may overtake the United States in 2020. We better do something about this. I think that is what Abenomics is. The key point of Abenomics, in my opinion, is that Japan has decided about 10 years too late, in a sense, but it's decided that it can do something about deflation. And deflation has been, as I said, as a colleague of mine said, in fact, a sorcerer's apprentice of debt, a machine for making a bad situation worse. Debts have risen as a percentage of a flat nominal GDP, which has not moved, if you remember, really since 1990. In that same period, Germany's GDP in nominal terms has doubled. The United States and the UK have gone up by 2.5 times. Japan, in nominal terms, not in real terms, but in nominal terms, has been flat. So Abenomics is a bold, perhaps a reckless attempt to overcome deflation by, in a sense, doing what everybody else has been doing, but doing it bigger, printing money until inflation returns. And after all, central banks know how to deal with inflation in a way that they don't know how to deal with deflation. So the presumption is that once you get to inflation, you can stop inflation from taking off and going crazy. But of course, we don't know that. It is, as I say, a gamble. And the risks are, for example, if long-term interest rates in Japan suddenly rise, then Japan's debt, which, although large, has been extremely cheap to service, could become very expensive to service. And 25% of Japan's budget already goes to debt servicing. If that became 50%, then having inflation could become a curse. Of course, the counter to that is that there'll be growth, tax revenue will go up, you'll move into a kind of virtuous circle. But that's a big question mark. So this is a bold gamble that could work. Even if it works, even if in a few years' time we say Abenomics was a gamble that worked, Japan now has stable to, let's say, 3% inflation, 4% nominal growth, its economy looks in much better shape, its exporters are doing well. This is the kind of perfect scenario for Japan. Even then, there are still huge problems. It still has to deal with this massive debt, and it still has to deal with a demographic problem. 25% of the Japanese are already over 65. Given that it has a very strict immigration policy, there are big unanswered questions, I think, about how Japan deals with that. So let's turn to Japan's diplomatic front. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. I'm certainly not going to go into the rights and wrongs of that. In fact, I take a rather cynical view that territorial disputes tend to be like children fighting in the playground. Who saw the ball first? Who saw the Senkaku? Who saw the Diaoyu first? So I don't see this particularly as a moral issue. I see it as a strategic and diplomatic one. And I may have time to talk a little bit more about that in my concluding remarks. There have obviously been big arguments over history, and the election of Abe, who is quite clearly, I would say, the most nationalist politician that Japan has had, at least since Nakasone. That has stirred up old questions with both China and, of course, with South Korea. Just a word about nationalism. I tend to think that Japanese nationalism is not quite as dangerous as some people in the region think. I think it needs to be put slightly in context. First of all, we talk about Japan's increased military budget. because Abe has increased the military budget. That is very, I would argue, symbolic. It's not particularly meaningful in monetary terms. And one has to remember that Japan's spending on the military, because after all that's what it is, even though it's not called a military, has been confined to 1% of GDP for an awful long time, and 1% of a GDP that has not moved. In fact, in the last 10 years, more or less, the military budget has gone down and down and down. So this is a tick up from a very low base. That would be my first point. The second would be that that viewed from afar, Japan can look it can look like a very kind of revisionist, right-wing place. You know, its leaders are just desperate to go to Yasukuni. Its textbooks miss out hugely important parts of history, like the Nanjing Massacre, for example. But I think that sometimes our view from afar is rather crude and is through the prism of the LDP, which I think has always been several steps to the right of the public at large. And I think we ought to acknowledge that a lot of the Japanese public is very, very attached to the Constitution with its pacifist Clause 9, written by Americans, but nonetheless embraced, I think, by a large amount of the Japanese public. I don't see the Constitution being overturned. Even if Abe could get it through Parliament, I really don't see, unless there's a terrible sort of sharpening of relations in the region, I don't see Japan jettisoning Article 9. And I think we should also remember that when Toru Hashimoto, who was for a while the rising star of Japanese politics, this right-wing guy who denied as the Japanese call it, Ianfu Mondai, the sex slaves case, he denied that there was force. But what happened to Hashimoto? He was not projected into the public sphere as many people feared. His political career was wrecked and he's now really nobody. So I would not entirely underestimate Japan's civil society or some elements of what you might call the kind of Japan's social democracy, the social democrats, those who used to be called socialists. I think they do act as a kind of check on the Japanese right. Nonetheless, the region is pretty dogged by history. A recent Pew poll on attitudes in this region showed that I think 13% of Koreans had a favorable view of Japan, 6% of Chinese. However, again, that can sometimes be overdone, and I have written myself that Japan is hated by all its neighbors, that Japan has never been able to overcome the legacy of the war. That's not entirely true. If you look at the Philippines, if you look at Indonesia, if you look at India, if you look at Myanmar now even, you could argue that Japan's relations with those countries have kind of never been better. And the same Pew poll showed that 79 to 80% of Filipinos and Indonesians had a favorable view of Japan. Now, one of my most surprising moments in the last 18 months or so was I was interviewing the Philippine foreign minister just before Abe was re-elected. And it suddenly occurred to me to ask, Mr. Foreign Minister, if Japan changed its constitution, if Japan rearmed, what would you think? Expecting him to say, oh, this would be terrible, you know, we need to all be friends, you know, we mustn't rile China. He said, I would welcome that. I would be delighted. We need a balance to China. And I said, kind of, is that on the record? And he said, absolutely. Now, I was sort of taken aback by that. Maybe I shouldn't have been. But I think it shows that the picture is more complex than is sometimes portrayed. I've got to think about 10, maybe 15 more minutes. So let me move briefly onto the US. I've talked about some of the kind of internal angst. Obviously, a factor that plays very strongly in the US is its experience of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in a sense, its failure to influence events in the way that it thought it could. You could argue that Al-Qaeda is no longer the threat, at least to the US, that it was. but certainly the nation-building efforts that the US thought that it could achieve in that region have failed. Then the 2008 financial crisis, which I mentioned before, but I think that has been a huge jolt. It's been a jolt internally to the US, really a sort of a questioning about the whole regulatory framework, a questioning to some extent even about, the nature of the Anglo-Saxon capitalist model. And if the US is not asking those questions as much as some might expect, I think the rest of the world certainly is. And I think this is why the US's image in China is not what it was, and is perhaps, in a sense, irrecoverable pre-2008, post-2008. And yet, we must not underestimate the United States. Its economy has bounced back faster than Europe, and faster maybe than we might have thought. When Japan had a huge asset bubble collapse, it's still in the doldrums 20 years later. The United States, we're now 5 years later. The economy is doing reasonably well. Unemployment is coming down. We're not there yet, but one could expect that things are going quite well for the Democrats. And if I were a betting person, which sometimes I am, I would, you'd bet on a Democratic victory. Perhaps Hillary Clinton next time round. The US did take, despite all these arguments in Washington, it did take drastic monetary policy measures, learning from Japan. It did bet the farm on quantitative easing. Of course, Bernanke has been massively criticized for that. But, I would argue, many people would argue, that that's kind of kept the US economy afloat and provided the room for it to come back. It has expanded fiscally, even though there have been huge arguments about that. Compared to, say, the United Kingdom, there has been counter-cyclical spending. It has not gone down the austerity route. And of course, the United States remains, and I say this almost smiling, but it does remain lucky. It suddenly found shale gas. I think that is one of the reasons you're seeing the United States becoming less interested in the Middle East. Egypt, Syria, even Saudi Arabia is now pulling away from the United States. You may well see US influence and desire to be influential in the Middle East receding somewhat. And it is still a phenomenally innovative country. Twitter might not yet be profitable, but the whole social media revolution, obviously the whole internet revolution before that, that has come out of the US. It has not come out of manufacturing Germany. It has not come out of once rampant Japan. It has not come out of South Korea. It is, still the world's big innovations are coming out of the US. And the military, United States spending is basically as much as the rest of the world combined, even though those budgets are under pressure. The United States still has an ability to project power more than any other country. And we're moving to obviously new kinds of ways of waging defense, waging war, if you like, and cyber is obviously is going to be the future, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think the revelations of Snowden, even though we only saw perhaps a tiny glimpse of the iceberg, but I think that really shows how far the US is ahead, how seriously it has taken this game. So, I don't think we can write the US off yet. I just want to come on briefly to US-China relations before I make a few very quick remarks about South Korea and then a very few concluding remarks. So the future of US-Chinese relations are very uncertain and in a sense will determine an awful lot of everything else. Unless we know the answer to how those relations look, we can't really know very much about the rest of the region. In some ways, you could argue that the relationship has been handled very maturely. China has been brought into the WTO, the global trading system, has been allowed access to markets. That has facilitated, along with the Pax Americana and the open sea lanes and the public goods that has provided. That has provided China with a stable background that has enabled its economic rise. And in a sense, Bob Zulik's notion of China as responsible stakeholder, you know, it's sort of it's become half true, certainly not whole true. There is an enormous effort on high-level dialogue between those two countries. You know, half the United States cabinet comes to Beijing every other year. This is dialogue on a level that we really haven't seen, that beats the dialogue between the US and Europe, US NATO, US UK. You know, and we were talking prematurely, but we were talking at some points about a G2 world. There's been a relative lack of trade friction, and what friction there has been managed more often than not within the framework of the World Trade Organization. And even crises have been overcome. The bombing of the Chinese embassy in former Yugoslavia, Cheng Guancheng and his scrambling out of the country last year, the Snowden incident, which could have become a big diplomatic incident. Instead, China sort of shuffled Snowden off to Russia. Still, there is an enormous lack of trust between those countries, and they still have what is known diplomatically as very different values. It's a word that I don't particularly like, but I think we all know what it means. The US is very suspicious of China in terms of cybersecurity, particularly industrial espionage. As we've seen, the US is hardly guiltless itself, but nonetheless, that's created a lot of bad blood in Washington. The US claims that China's military spending lacks transparency. I've never really bought that claim. I mean, all military spending is to some extent untransparent. What's the point of telling everybody what you have? And to some extent, China's spending is natural. You know, it's a growing power. One would expect it to spend on the military, but still, there is a lot of suspicion, and there has been a lack. There have been attempts, but there has really been a lack of military to military contacts, and those can be suspended very quickly when, for example, the US supplies arms to Taiwan. Then, of course, there is the US pivot, which looks very much to China like US attempts at containment. But even the pivot is uncertain. As soon as we launched the pivot, Kerry came in and he's rebranded it a rebalancing. And he's also spent all his time in the Middle East and very little time in this part of the world. So how serious is the US pivot? And how should other countries, how should Malaysia, how should Indonesia, how should Japan, how should the Philippines, how seriously should they take the US commitment to this region and, in a sense, the kind of balancing out of China? We really don't know the answers to these questions. The US has a view of this region that disputes should be settled in a multilateral fashion. China's view is that disputes should be settled bilaterally because, of course, that favors China. Let me move on very, very quickly to South Korea and then make a few concluding remarks, and then I'll be very happy to take questions because I've missed, I'm sure, an awful lot out. Again, the South Korean economy, I think, is a little bit like the Chinese economy, in that the world has finally realized how strong the South Korean economy is. But the truth is that if you look at the South Korean economy from within, it looks slightly weaker than it does from afar. Of course, this has been the miracle on the Han. In a sense, it's been the most remarkable of the Northeast Asian economic trajectories, even more than Japan's, which began, after all, in Meiji. Korea's really began after the Second World War, and in 30 years it became, you know, a wealthy country. Everyone now knows, of course, about Samsung and Hyundai. Rather less known, I think, is that South Korean companies compete extremely well in emerging market countries, where they often, for example, in India, in Indonesia, where they often beat rivals, for example, Japan. Korea is now catching up Japan in terms of GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, and even in terms of absolute dollar basis at $32,000 dollars per head. It's coming up on Japan, which is about 45, if I remember. South Korea, the 12th biggest economy in the world. But, and here's the but, you knew it was coming, South Korea is heavily reliant on exports. About 50% of GDP is dependent on exports. And the world does not look like a particularly friendly place for exports at the moment. And I think more importantly for me is the kind of domestic discontent. Whenever I'm in South Korea, I'm surprised at the almost disconnect between kind of shiny, striving Korea, hosting a G20, becoming wealthy, exporting all over the world, and some of the kind of angst that you have here in South Korea over unequal distribution of wealth, over an undeveloped social welfare system, suicides which are even higher than in Japan, demographics which are even worse than in Japan, although a little bit behind, but still the birth rate is actually lower than in Japan. So some of the questions that Japan is facing will be faced by Korea in the next years, although thankfully Korea doesn't have the terrible debt situation that Japan has. But I thought it was interesting that Park Geun-hye was elected on a kind of social democratic platform. She had to move to the left in order to make herself electable. Just to run extremely quickly through South Korea's diplomatic state. The relations with the US are extremely tight. There was even a suggestion during the DPJ government of Japan, under Hatoyama, etc., that US relations with South Korea were now better than US relations with Japan. They, of course, have a free trade agreement, which is considered a pioneer. Park's first visit was to Washington. Now, Park celebrated the victory of both Abe and Park because they saw it as a kind of a move to, more conservative leaders that they knew how to deal with. But of course, to America's discomfort, those two countries, are not exactly getting along. And last year, when they failed to sign, what the Americans thought was a fairly simple intelligence sharing agreement, I think that was a big shock in Washington that South Korea pulled away from that. Even a swap arrangement, again, sort of a symbolic arrangement, a currency swap arrangement, that has now not been renewed. And so these two countries, which America considers its strongest allies in Northeast Asia, are, barely on speaking terms. And of course, there's this intriguing tilt towards China that Park Geun-hye has begun to hint at. The second place she visited was Beijing. She speaks Chinese. She's an admirer of Chinese culture. The two countries have moved a little closer on North Korea, although, of course, Park has stuck to the idea that there will be no talks for talk's sake. One mustn't get too hung up on one leader, but nonetheless, it's sort of intriguing. If South Korea is a swing state, at the moment it's swinging towards China. Just a very few conclusions, and of course my conclusions will be more like questions than conclusions, so forgive me. History remains, as I once called it in the Financial Times, a sort of a rotting corpse at the end of this region's diplomatic garden. If you look at the leaders of the countries today, they are the sons and daughters of previous leaders. Xi Jinping, the son of Xi Jong-sun, who of course was very close to Mao. Park Geun-hye, I don't need to tell you, the daughter of Park Chung-hee. Abe, the grandson of Kishi, somebody who was at one stage arrested by the Americans as a possible A-class war criminal, then released, then rehabilitated, then made prime minister, who then signed a very close, the US-Japan pact in 1960. Kim Jong-un, again, son of Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, that's obviously par for the course, but nonetheless, it's almost as though history is repeating itself, and the sons and the daughters and the grandsons are here, in a sense, fighting the same old battles. Europe was trapped in history once, and it's had a very hard time untrapping itself. What I would say is that what Europe has had is an architecture since the Second World War. Last year, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Some people thought this was a joke, but they said, well, at least it wasn't awarded the Nobel Prize for economics. But in fact, I kind of think that the award of the prize to the EU was symbolically quite interesting, because of course, you know, the EU has been instrumental. It's an economic project, but really it's a political project dressed up as an economic one. And it has kept Europe a continent that was the most bloody and brutal, divided in the world. It has kept it in more or less harmony. Of course, you know, there are tensions. Of course, there are the economic rationale of the EU is under tremendous strain, but as a political project, it's been a success. Asia has nothing to compare with that at all. It has APEC, it has ASEAN, it has ASEAN Plus. You know, the best that you can say is that this is the East Asian Summit, which at least brings all the players together in a overtly kind of security-oriented dialogue. But there is really no architecture in which to resolve any of the disputes that I've talked about. Just finally, I just leave you, and it's in a sense not a happy thought, but there is something called the Thucydides trap, which relates to Greece and Sparta. And the Thucydides trap was that Greece was the preeminent power, confident in its preeminence, and then along came Sparta. Sparta challenged Greece, and the two, of course, ended up going to war, and in a sense, mutually destroying each other. Now, there's a Harvard professor who has counted in the last since 1500, 15 incidents of where a country has come to kind of challenge the global order. And in his reckoning, in 11 out of those cases, the result has been war. Now, I definitely don't want to over-dramatize. Of course, it's my profound hope, and in fact my belief, that it will not come to this. But the rise of China and the ability of the rest of the world to adapt to the rise of a big power, and of a power, as I suggested, of the like that we haven't seen before, is really, I think, the enormous challenge of the next 20, 30, 40 years, as far as I can look ahead. You know, again, without wishing to be melodramatic, it took Europe 2 big wars to kind of resolve its difficulties. You know, Asia, you could argue, has had 1 big war. It is certainly my profound hope that it can stop at 1 big war, that it can resolve these difficulties. In order to do so, I think, you know, there's going to need to be some serious initiatives, some serious architecture building, and some, as Deng Xiaoping would say, some wise heads. I'll stop there. I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for very, very, not only illuminating, but very, very penetrating analysis of domestic situation in major countries in the region. In fact, covered wider than this, the Korea, China, Japan, and Northeast Asia. And you covered very well the geopolitical and diplomatic relations among countries in the region, and in fact, global, the geopolitical situation. And I appreciate very much for your very, very penetrating and illuminating views. I'm sure we have many questions and comments, and Ambassador wants to take the first place in making comments.
David, compliments for an interesting and thought-provoking address. You made, amongst others, two interesting observations from my perspective. One, when you mentioned that China has been investing almost 50% of its GDP year after year after year. And that you observed is on the higher side, which basically means that there is overcapacity, there is excessive infrastructure perhaps. You also mentioned that the world is not exactly a friendly place for exports these days. So I'm just wanting to link the two and wanting your perspective. Now, overcapacity and excessive infrastructure would mean that there is excessive production, and but there is not enough of demand. Now, if you cannot export, you have to increase domestic consumption, which China has been trying to do without much success. So where does it add up if the domestic consumption is not going to increase and exports are not going to rise? So where does it lead to? And a related clarification or the thought of yours is that I was reading that again Chinese banks are now perhaps saddled with NPAs. And a few years ago, you will recall that a massive infusion of funds was made into Chinese banks to clean up the balance sheets. Do you see a return to the old situation, or is it not as bad? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we collect a couple more and before you?
Okay. All right. I might get confused.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Kim and Professor Hong and yes. Yes.
I have so many questions, but I'll just confine to one. You mentioned about U.S. fading influences, Pax Americana.
Yes.
Of course, sequestration dramatically showed the event, but I think it was more of an accident.
Which event?
Sequestration
yes.
was more of an accident because I think they set up this sequestration as a threat so that they would be forced to come to an agreement, which they did between Obama and Boehner. But then the problem was that there was no internal unity within the Republican Party. I think there is a counter-reaction to that, and they are now realizing that somehow they have to modify this, and I think, as you mentioned, that is also, to some extent, fading away. That will, I think, is restore the two-party system, which will bypass. But beyond that, U.S. shale gas production has now turned them, as of last month, net exporters of natural gas. And there is now a speculation within a few years, U.S. advantage of energy cost will make U.S. car industries even coming back to the United States. So I think the U.S. dominance on economic power is far greater than people expect in the next few decades at least. In the meantime, I think, as you pointed out, that China's strength is also overstated outside. And China probably is more of a problem to itself than to the outside world, as you see all the problems they have. And in order to fix that, their attention cannot be so outward looking. And I think some of the problems they have with the Philippines, Vietnam, etc., is to some extent a temporary reaction of Chinese nationalism. As they see the last few decades they have suffered on the hands of Western powers, they figure now they got the power to get it back at it. But the true leadership's intention, as Deng Xiaoping himself was, not interested in that kind of stuff, but fixing the China's problems. So looking at the next few decades, I think China will turn more fixing their own problems rather than taking fights with the outside world. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, please make your questions and comments as brief as possible. Professor
Thank
Hong.
you, Mr. Piling. Actually, I am a favorable reader of Financial Times.
Thank you.
And even though it's the first time seeing each other, I know your face even so well. Thank you. I have two questions. First one is about the state enterprise, the owned enterprises
Yes.
in China. there were so many critique and recommendation about the reform of SOE. Without the reformation, especially last year, World Bank has recommended so strongly, without SOE reformation, China might be apt to fall into middle income traps, like other countries. And even this time, when on the third plenum, most people expected and anticipated there will be some of the direction for SOE reforms. But actually, we finding that the resistance against of this reform of SOE side so influential.
Yes.
So in this matters related, what is your anticipation forecast? That's my first question. Second one is about the TPP related. We know that China has a different position, especially against U.S. and the Japanese movement for TPP. And China is with the other Asian countries, they are promoting some kind of so-called the regional economic, the comprehensive partnership and so on.
RCEP.
And I'm finding Korea in between, very delicate position, thinking of China and the U.S. in any senses. So what do you recommendation about for Korea to take these participation on TPP related?
Okay.
And what your suggestion?
All right, great.
Thank you.
Good.
Let me start with that, and then I'll work backwards. So the TPP versus the RCEP. I guess I think that the TPP is in some trouble. It does look like to me. I mean, it's obviously there is a trade element to the TPP for sure. There is it's part of the pivot. The US wants access to the fastest growing region in the world. It wants to drive access for its companies. So there's a pure trade element, I think. But there is also, I think, in a sense, a desire to reinvent the world pre-WTO. Because China was invited into the world trading system, and China has done very, very well out of that. Part of the consequence of that, I think, has been the stagnation of the middle class in Europe and the United States. It's not the only reason by any means, but bringing in, hundreds of millions of perfectly competent workers who can do jobs for lower wages than, perfectly competent workers in America or Europe or elsewhere. And that has kind of changed the balance. So I think there is a desire to sort of, as I say, or a hankering after the world before the WTO. I think there is also a kind of, there is an element of the TPP as excluding China, or at the very least of excluding China so that it is forced to come up to what the United States considers, 21st century standards in trade, where non-tariff barriers are dismantled, where you mentioned SOEs, where the actions and regulation of state companies are more a more even playing field is created in terms of access to capital, etc., public tenders, all those kind of things. However, I think that the TPP is in trouble for a number of reasons. One is that if you just look at the disparate countries that are putative members of the TPP, it doesn't feel right. I mean, why is Vietnam in the TPP when China can't be? Do we really think that Vietnamese state-owned enterprises are, much more competitive and not given a shelter as Chinese SOEs are? I don't think so. So it looks as though there's an attempt to bring Vietnam, for example, into this grouping, not entirely for trade reasons, but for some political reasons as well. And then I think there's also a hedging in Asia. I mean, we've seen, for example, very recently, Malaysia turned quite strongly against the TPP, saying that it's an anti-Malaysian agreement, that in a number of ways it will impact negatively. And funnily enough, this is a kind of cross-party agreement that the TPP is not what Malaysia thought it was. And even, Australia, even New Zealand, even the big, modern economies, they all have their difficulties with the TPP. So what I think will happen is that I suspect that something will be signed, but I suspect that it will not be the great breakthrough 21st century agreement that it's been built, because in order to satisfy all these different constituencies, I think it will have to be watered down. If it's not, I don't think it will be signed. There's an intriguing further possibility, which is that for years, China has seen, for some of the reasons that I've suggested, has seen TPP as kind of antagonistic, part of this kind of keep China out, encircle China. In a sense, it's now more recently begun to call the bluff of the TPP and say, well, maybe we'll join. And that's been the mood music coming out of Beijing recently. And then, of course, as you mentioned, it has its own RCEP, which has not the same pretensions of the TPP, but, is a very geographically broad body, if it ever comes to fruition. I suppose my advice to South Korea would be wait and see. Wait and see how all this, the US has, Washington sort of trade bodies have said that, the TPP will be signed by the end of this year. It's the firm intention to sign the TPP by the end of this year. I'd be amazed. I would be amazed if it's signed by the end of this year. Let me go back to, let's see. So the whole rebalancing, the Chinese rebalancing, how does it add up? Well, I suppose my answer would be, well, it doesn't add up, and that's the problem. I wrote a column once for the Financial Times, where it was, of course, a joke, but what I said was, the Financial Times has sent me to China on many long and expensive trips. I've been 20 times, I've spent a lot of Financial Times money, I've returned and I have come back with one very profound conclusion, which is that China is a very big country. Now, in a sense, obviously, that's a joke, but China's size is crucial, I think, to understanding all sorts of things about it. One is, you mentioned exports. So Japan, which is a country of 120 million people, Japan managed to export its way to wealth and get to roughly 90% of US GDP per capita in the late 80s, before it's gone back now to maybe 80%, maybe even a little bit less now. But, it got there, it got nearly there before it got found out. Remember in the 80s, there were congressmen sort of smashing Japanese cars and Japanese Walkmen and what have you. In a sense, China has been rumbled. It's been found out earlier. It's been found out at 20% of US GDP. So the export route to China is blocked. It's impossible. China cannot export its way to wealth. So it has to find another motor. Now, the motor that it's found is investment. And again, that motor, I think, is sputtering. So it must find a motor from demand. That is obviously very, very difficult for a number of reasons, which partly answers the SOE question, I think. One is, there are an awful lot of vested interests around the production state. And Japan, to an extent, was a production state. The whole economy was geared to big manufacturers, big exporters, who have been privileged in the system. Privileged in all sorts of ways. So one obvious way is the banking system, which suppresses interest rates for savers, so that money can be funneled around to favored enterprises, and banks get a spread, and therefore are profitable. So it's a system that works, but it's one that's very, very, very difficult to unpick. So that, I would say, is one huge obstacle. Another, which is often talked about, and I think correctly, is the lack of a social safety net. Now, you've heard this 1,000 times before, so I don't really need to go into it in too much detail, but the fact that social services are so sketchy means that people are saved for catastrophic events. They save for their retirement, which is not a catastrophic event, but it's an expected one. But they save for illness. They save in order to put their children through university, like Korea becoming, an ever more expensive process. As more people have access, you need to spend more and more and more to distinguish your child from all the others. Because of the one-child policy, you now need to buy your child, if he's a boy anyway, an apartment so that he can get married. China's becoming a very expensive place to prosper in. And all that is leading people to save. Of course, property is not counted as private consumption. And I would just put one caveat to that. So, if you look at the official figures, it looks as though China's been going completely the wrong way. If you go to China, it doesn't actually seem like that. There is a lot of spending. It's a bit silly journalistically to say you go into a shopping mall and everybody seems to be spending. But there is a lot of spending. There's a sense that younger people are not saving as much as their parents. There's a sense that there's more of an appetite to take on credit. So I think things are changing. And I think that the figures may overstate the investment versus private consumption. I wouldn't overdo this, but there are some accounting problems, things like imputed rent, which in the United States is counted as private consumption. This is how much you spend to live in your own house. So you've bought your house, and there is an accounting tool in GDP that says how much would it cost if you were renting that house. There is no such thing in China. So that would tend to kind of falsely lower the actual levels of consumption. There is also disputes about what should we count as consumption, and if parts of the government, and of course the government is bigger in some senses because of the SOEs, etc., and the local governments and the trust companies they set up and all of that. So what is private spending and what is public spending? And it may be that some supposedly public spending, let's say a man works for a big SOE and buys a car really for himself, but it's counted as SOE investment. So there may be some overcounting. So I wouldn't want to overdo that, but the situation may not be quite as extreme as it appears. And I think that I've answered all those questions.
Yeah.
I think I agree with everything you said. So.
There was more comments than questions. Okay, the last round, two professors, Professor Kim and Dr. Lee, please.
Okay, I'm Professor Kim of Seungkyunkwan University.
Hello.
I have a very short question on China.
Okay.
I have read the results of the third plenum meeting of China's recent Communist Party Congress, and I got the impression that China has made a big stride towards free market capitalism. And President Xi Jinping is planning on sweeping reforms, economic reforms and market liberalization. And the Premier Li Keqiang is an economist by training.
Yep.
He's, strongly advocating a free market system. He has recently appointed Professor Lin of Beijing University. He used to be the vice president of the World Bank, and he's got a PhD from the University of Chicago, which is the mecca of free market capitalism. Despite all these efforts made by China, a lot of critics say that free market capitalism cannot be rooted in a communist country like China. So what is your response to this? Thank you.
Okay. Shall I answer that question, then we can go on to the next? Okay. First of all, your reading of the third plenum and my reading of the third plenum is slightly different. It is true there is talk about a decisive shift to market capitalism, but everything else is kind of vague and turgid and a bit sort of contradictory. It is true that Li Keqiang is an economist he signed up to the World Bank document, which was very, radical. What I would say is, there is very little evidence in the first year of actually things on the ground that you could point to say, you know, there is a bold opening. There is tinkering, and China has tinkered very well. You could also argue, actually, that boldness is not really necessarily what China wants. You know, you could do this too quickly. But what I would say is that it's very difficult. So even if you're right, and even if the intention is bold market reform, then I think the second part of your question, I would begin to agree with. For example, let's take the banking sector. You know, the Chinese Communist Party gets a lot of power from the ability to be able to set interest rates and to be able to tell banks, lend to this sector, lend to that province, don't lend to him, do lend to him. To relinquish power by telling banks, lend according to your perceived risk and return. So cut off, you know, the cement factory in Guizhou, you know, close down the steel factory in Mongolia, invest in this guy who, you know, has been on the internet criticizing the Communist Party. It all kind of smacks of a loss of control that I think, you know, for obvious reasons, does not come naturally. And I think that applies even more to opening the capital account. So I've been rather suspicious of the idea that China's suddenly going to have, you know, the renminbi is going to be a reserve currency. It's going to challenge the dollar. Because again, I think that is really difficult. How does the Communist Party open the capital account? That means money can flow out crazily. It means money can flow in crazily with all the dangers that of overheating and inflation. And it's not necessarily, from a macroeconomic point of view, a particularly good thing to do at this stage of its development. I used to live in Chile. Chile had quite careful capital account controls at a time of the Washington Consensus, when everybody knew that the best thing was to be open and completely free to let money flow in and out. And then Indonesia happened, and then Thailand happened. And it didn't look so good, and Chile looked better. So you wouldn't even necessarily advise, as I say. Just take one other reform that's been mooted. Hukou reform, the registration. Again, you know, that's an obvious reform that China could implement, both for kind of equitable reasons to address, you know, I think building resentment that some people are living the China dream and some people are not. But it could also have a strong economic element to it. China has recently reached, or is reaching, depend on who you talk to, the Lewis point, which means that its ability to grow simply by adding labor from the countryside has now run out of steam. And we've seen Chinese wages rising. We've seen some Chinese industries, textiles, etc., toy makers begin to move out. So China needs to move to a new phase of innovation. But you know, that is far easier said than done. So I'll stop there. But I think
okay. The last question from Dr. Lee.
I will be very brief. You started your lecture by mentioning the angst among the public about the stagnant middle class and,
yes.
in other words, the polarization of
yes.
the social class.
Yeah.
Not only in the U.S. but also in Korea and in other countries. China,
almost everywhere.
China also.
Yes.
My question is that you also mentioned that there is now a lot of discussions, you know, globally about rethinking or re-looking the so-called Anglo-Saxon
yes.
capitalist system. Then my question is, in your opinion, you know, and from your experience about traveling, attending the global seminar meetings, is there any prospect for solving this, you know, lingering issue which is very difficult. But we need to solve this problem, but we do not have any answer yet. So I want to hear your insightful illuminating.
Yeah, I'm going to
this.
draw a blank here. I mean, this, I mean, I'm in favor of global trade. As it happens, I'm in favor of global trade because I think it gives poor countries a chance. Global trade is meant to be a win-win. But what it's turned out to be, I think, is it's been a win for big businesses, and the wealthy and the very well educated in the West. And it's been a win by and large for poorer countries that are able to get onto that ladder, export their way to the big Western markets. But the big sufferer has been, the middle class in the wealthy countries, which, increasingly have fewer skills that, their skills are increasingly challenged. I mean, you need to be that much better educated, that much more insightful, that much more something, to command a wage that is hugely higher than somebody else in another country who previously you weren't competing with. So, again, I once wrote a column, because in a sense, and this sounds terrible, but in a sense, I think this is good. I'm probably part of the stagnating middle class. I'm in an industry that might get, decimated. But if you take somebody shifting boxes around in London, or driving a bus in London, until fairly recently, it was taken for granted that if you moved boxes around in the UK, you deserved a wage that was 20 times more than somebody shifting boxes around in India. From an equitable point of view, you could argue, well, why? If somebody can shift boxes around in India and somebody can shift boxes, why shouldn't they be paid the same? Of course, to be paid the same would mean an enormous shift in wealth, not only between countries, but within countries. And the great dilemma, I suppose, for, America, for Europe, is to, keep its people sort of ahead of the game. But in a sense, it's a losing battle because, we had this enormous divergence with the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So after hundreds and hundreds of years where GDP per capita around the world was kind of more or less the same, people were working more or less in the countryside. Of course there were cities, but overall GDP per capita did not differ hugely. A country's overall wealth depended really on its population. And then suddenly you had the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly it became normal for somebody in Britain to be 40 times wealthier than somebody in the Philippines. Because they had kind of got access to technology, know-how that somebody elsewhere in the world didn't. Well, that gap is closing. In aggregate, I think that's a wonderful thing. It obviously creates enormous problems within those countries and a, divergence of wealth that I think is sort of threatens the soul, in a sense, of Western democracies. I mean, as electors, we're not happy that all the wealth that is created goes to a very, very small percentage of the population. And, this is why Romney's remark about the 47%, I think, went down so badly, because the 47% was probably 90%, and they all felt offended. So, I don't have, I cannot give you an answer, but I can only put the dilemma in those terms, I think.
Yeah. Well, I suppose we can go on all day, and really appreciate for your very, very insightful views, not only this region, but the whole the globe. And I think that the last point, I think this is really big challenge for the capitalist system. I don't think it's just the globalization, but the deepening knowledge society marrying with the globalization intensify this polarization. And so this will become a social and political issue, and it may be a challenge for sustaining the capitalism system. So one of the solution, not maybe the solution, but the mechanism to help sustain the system, maybe the strengthening social safety net and the social welfare system to that extent. Of course, affordable the social welfare system. But in any case, thank you very much for your view, and we hope you'll come back to Seoul more frequently. Of course, we read your column and your writings, and we're looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
And I
so
hope
much.
you write a book on Korea.
I would love to.
Favorable. Well, with this, please join me.